A very popular management book in the 1990s was written by Stephen Covey about the 7 habits of highly effective people. The 5th habit of that is to seek first to understand, then to be understood. High correlation with listening. Former U.S. President Harry S. Truman said, "The good Lord gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. That ought to tell us something." We should spend significantly more time listening than we spend speaking. There's an Arabic saying that says, "If I listen, I have the advantage. If I speak, others will have it." One of the valuable aspects of listening. This is part 1 of the lecturette on listening. Keep in mind that even after years of practice listening, we still don't do it very well, because it's not a matter of practice makes perfect, but a matter of perfect practice makes perfect. We should listen more effectively because it can benefit us in a variety of ways. It can make the difference between knowledge or ignorance, having the information, knowing the information, or being completely ignorant, not knowing that information. Being informed or misinformed. Being misinformed often happens when you listen ineffectively and you only catch part of what somebody says. When you listen, you become more involved. Apathetic meaning you don't care. So when you get involved listening, you start to become involved. And then finally, when you listen to something effectively, you are much more likely to enjoy something than to be bored by it. This lecturette, I want you to listen for the following concepts. What is listening? And then we'll talk about the aspects of the listening process. Starting with what listening is. Consider that the majority of your time spent communicating is spent listening. A study that was reported in 2001 says that in our waking hours, we spend about 70% of our time communicating. Of that 70%, the breakdown is that almost half of that time, 45%, we spend listening. In fact, look and realize that reading and speaking combined is about the same amount of time that we spend listening. As college students, we understand that most of our educational courses are source-oriented, meaning we have to listen to the source or the instructor most of the time. Remembering the communication model, you'll recall that listening occurs at both ends of the feedback loop, because when the message gets through the channel to the receiver and the receiver decodes that information, the receiver then also sends back information to the source, where the source will then listen. However, there's no way to get around the fact that when you are playing the role of the receiver, you are listening most of the time. As human beings, we receive data orally. That means through the ears. So we receive verbal information, words, vocal information. You can tell whether somebody is upset or not just by the quality of their voice. And then, of course, there's other sounds that we process for information. It's important to realize that listening is an active rather than a passive skill. We hear whether we want to or not, but we usually don't listen until we force ourselves to pay attention and listen. Another way to look at it is that listening is a psychological skill, while hearing is a physiological skill. This will make more sense when you think about listening as a process. It starts with the physiological aspect, by the sound waves hitting your eardrums so that you can get the information. Then you have the selection process. So now you've heard a lot of information. You have to sort through those and then figure out what you're going to focus on or pay attention to. Some textbooks will combine these 2 steps into a single step. Then you have to understand or audit that information. You have to put what your ears have processed and that you've selected and paid attention to, and now you have to make some sense out of it. You have to make words make sense. Then you have to put it into either short-term or long-term memory so that you can retrieve that information later. if somebody says, "Hi, my name is Patty," the fact that you're able to respond with "Hi, Patty" means that you remembered at least my name, Patty, for long enough to give that information back, which leads to the last step that some scholars add, which is the responding process, confirming that you have heard somebody and listened to somebody. As the example I gave you was, if you remember my name and you say my name back, then verbally you are communicating that you remember, you heard that information. But you can also do that non-verbally. So as I said, there's a difference between short-term and long-term memory. Short-term memory would be something like you can remember a telephone number long enough to dial it, but you can't remember that number 5 minutes later. Some people believe that you have between 5 and 7 slots that you can put short-term memory in. So you can have 5 pieces of information at a time. The one I've heard most recently is 7. So which means it's not a coincidence that most of our phone numbers are 7 digits in length, because we can remember each number fitting in every single slot. But as soon as you fill up those slots, you have to empty a slot in order to add a new piece of information in. So short-term memory is stored in one part of the brain. Long-term memory is stored in another part of the brain. You might recall your hometown, your parents' first name, birth dates. Those sorts of things go into long-term memory. What's the difference between short-term and long-term memory other than the fact that they're in different parts of the brain? The amount of repetition and rehearsing information that goes into long-term memory, you spend more time repeating and rehearsing. You've said it multiple times. When you study, you repeat things back to yourself so that you're more likely to move it from short-term to long-term memory. And then how easily does that information connect with information that you already know? Can you draw links between it? If you heard my name is Patty, you might think of somebody else whose name is Patty, and that might help you remember that information. We also will use mnemonic devices, particularly when we're trying to recall information. We could do it with people too, but information such as, if I were to ask you to name the 5 Great Lakes, you might have to sit there and think about it. Maybe over time you would get it, but you would likely get it a lot faster if I gave you the word homes to jog your memory, because homes is information you already have in your memory. You know that word. So then it's easier to remember Huron because of the H, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior because you have the mnemonic device of homes. In math, one way people remember the order of mathematical operations, what comes first, is "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," or PEMDAS. Because if you remember PEMDAS, you'll remember that you perform what's in the parentheses before you perform exponents, and then multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. These are ways that we try to move information from short-term memory into long-term memory. So some questions for you to contemplate as we move forward. First is, why do you think it's important to listen effectively? And then, how much time do you spend listening? Do you spend about what most people spend, which is 45% of your communication time is spent listening, more or less? And why would there be a difference? And then finally, when somebody says, "I'm listening," what does that really mean? Think about the difference again between listening and hearing.